Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on unlocking the missing middle, legal reforms and other solutions to address housing options in Massachusetts and by extension other states as well. Before I introduce, let me highlight a couple of other upcoming talks in our fall series. On Wednesday, November 5th, so about a week and a half from today, Karen Clary and Lars Benson, who are the director and assistant director for homelessness at the Harvard Kennedy School's Government Performance Lab, will be speaking about a new Government Performance Lab study focused on how providers can make better use of data to track vacancies in permanent supportive housing and also more quickly move people into those vacant units. It's a really interesting piece of work, and it builds on work that they've been doing in several cities and counties around the country. On Friday, November 7th, so 2 days after that, Stephanie Kesselman, the new housing director at Arnold Ventures, and will be reporting on research she did as a Meyer doctoral fellow here at the center on whether and how Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities incentive program affected the quantity, type, and timing of new housing built since that law's adoption in 2017. More information about these and other Joint Center events and activities is, of course, site. Now, the speaker today is Amy Tomasso, who is the Director of Policy Innovations at Ivory Innovations, which, as many of you know, is based at the University of Utah's Eccles School of Business. Amy's a former Joint Center graduate research assistant, and she'll be speaking about a series of papers that she wrote, and one which is forthcoming, on how we might expand the supply of missing middle housing, which many policymakers and advocates see as one of the possible solutions to the affordable housing crisis. And I'll let Amy tell you exactly what we mean when we talk about middle housing. Amy will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes. When she's done, I will come back on and we'll have a Q&A. I'll be drawing on questions that I hope you'll be submitting through Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions, but we will share them with Amy so she'll know how people have been reacting. Questions. A video and copy of Amy's slides will be posted on our website early next week. Amy, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Okay. And are you seeing the right one?
We are.
Okay, awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Tomasso, and I'm so thrilled to share my series of working papers, Unlocking the Missing Middle, What Can Massachusetts Learn from Other States to Encourage More Missing Middle Housing with you today. While these papers focus on Massachusetts, the policies and actions they recommend can apply broadly. So wherever you're tuning in from, I hope you gain valuable takeaways to expand housing options in your community. So here's what we'll be covering today. First, I'll give a little background on myself and how I got involved with missing middle housing. Then I'll walk you through the 3 papers in the Unlocking the Missing Middle series. So part 1, Surveying Missing Middle Housing, which was released in April, covers trends in the United States and Massachusetts. Like, what is missing middle housing, why is it missing, and what are the specific barriers as well as recent opportunities in Massachusetts? Part 2, Legalizing Missing Middle Housing, Recommended Reforms for Massachusetts, was released in August and proposes 6 statewide zoning and other regulatory reforms to lay the requisite legal and land use foundation for middle housing expansion. And part 3, Building Missing Middle Housing, Recommended Tools Beyond Policy Reform, will advance 6 statewide actions to create a middle housing ecosystem beyond policy, from funding and advocacy to developer training. And part 3 is forthcoming next month in November, so you'll be the first to hear these recommendations today. So first, let's go back a few years. I was a community planning and project manager at the state of Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. And I had the chance to work on a dream project, the Vermont Homes for All Toolkit. It was a builder's workbook and design guide to bring missing middle housing back to Vermont as a practical, community-oriented solution to our housing crisis. Crisscrossing the state to meet with developers, policymakers, and local residents alike, I fell in love with missing middle housing and its potential. But the thing about missing middle housing, as we'll get into, is that it's been very hard to build. I wanted to understand everything I could about missing middle housing and how to build it, which led me to the Master in Real Estate program at Harvard and a graduate research fellowship at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, researching missing middle solutions for Massachusetts. This research is funded by the Simone Foundation, which also funded the Joint Center's recent reports on ADUs. I want to thank their generous support for this work on advancing housing solutions in Massachusetts, and also thank everyone who contributed to this effort through interviews, emails, data, images, graphics. Thank you. So let's get into it. What is missing middle housing and why did it go missing? We'll start with the middle part. To put it simply, middle housing is the home type between a single-family residence and a large-scale apartment building. The term was coined by Dan Perolik of Opticos Design in 2010, and he has made a series of ingenious graphics to represent the scale of housing, including the one on this slide. Look at the home types in red: the duplexes, triplexes, courtyard apartments, cottage clusters, row houses, mansion apartments, and live-work setups. This is medium density multifamily or middle scale housing. While missing middle housing is inclusive of many home types, they share a few common characteristics, including low-rise height, usually 3 stories or less, unit counts between 2 to 19 units, location in walkable context, which also means reduced need for off-street parking spaces, and smaller unit sizes between 500 to 1,200 square feet. Finally, building footprints that can fit within a single-family residence, which makes middle housing camouflage within single-family neighborhoods and really fits in to existing built-out environments. Even if the term missing middle housing is new, you probably can think of examples of the kinds of neighborhoods where you would find these homes. Missing middle neighborhoods are great for Halloween, kid-friendly, porch-rich, walkable places. Middle housing just makes sense because it provides housing diversity of sizes, scales, and price points that work for different life stages and needs. Think about seniors looking to downsize with few market options, or a young family looking for a starter home, or a single person looking to build equity by buying a duplex and renting out half of it. Middle housing fills these needs. Not everyone wants to, has access to, or can thrive in a single family home or a large apartment building, but those are almost exclusively the two housing options currently being built. And while all construction is expensive today, middle housing also offers the promise of lower cost by design home types. Why? Because middle housing is best sited on small infill lots with access to existing infrastructure, are often wood framed, make intelligent design of small spaces, and ideally do not devote excessive land to parking, so they're a lower cost housing product than competitors. Another big reason for middle housing's market sense is that it can meet a growing demographic mismatch. Households are shrinking while the average size of a new single-family home is growing. That's a direct response to only allowing one home per lot in most places. That means the square footage of living space per person has grown 3.5 times in the last 75 years, and all this extra space has a carrying cost. Small home construction, as you can see on the graph on the right, has also declined to less than 10% of new housing in about the same time frame. A few other salient demographic points. In Greater Boston, 1 in 2 person households make up about 60% of the region. And across the US, 1 out of every 5 people will be over 65 by 2030. Smaller households, seniors needing to downsize, larger homes, unaffordable housing, it just doesn't add up, and missing middle housing can fill this void. Okay, so we've covered the middle part, but what about the missing part? The short answer is that middle housing is expensive and illegal, and it's illegal because of zoning. The modern day zoning regime codified ideals of car dependency, exclusionary suburban enclaves, and Euclidean separation of land uses. Multifamily housing, even medium scale homes like duplexes, were excluded from by right zoning uses. And as a result, the market contracted around a few accepted home types, leaving middle housing missing. If this home type couldn't be built, economies of scale disappeared too, from capable middle housing home builders to frictionless permitting and approvals processes to financing mechanisms. And the rest is a waterfall effect. Building codes switch from residential to commercial code at 3 units, meaning it's much more technically challenging to build a triplex, even if research shows that up to 6 units don't require all the excesses of commercial code. And since missing middle housing now required special permits and project variances, regulatory barriers were introduced. And finally, cultural consensus has all too often been that increased housing density is a social ire. An important point is that middle housing is not the only answer to the housing crisis. Nothing is, but we need more housing units of all sizes, scales, and price points. Massachusetts needs over 200,000 units to correct its current shortage. So, looking at this hypothetical graphic on the screen, look at how many more units can be added and how much more efficiently land is used when middle housing is allowed. How has this story played out in Massachusetts? Waves of European immigration in the late 1800s demanded a rapidly proliferating housing solution, and the triple-decker, produced through balloon framing construction and efficiently stacking kitchens and bathrooms across 3 units, was the locally invented answer. Over 15,000 of these homes were built in Greater Boston alone between 1880 and 1930. You know them when you see them, and you can't walk down a street in Boston's inner ring suburbs and across the state without seeing a triple decker. So, what happened to them? The backlash against triple deckers, or rather their immigrant inhabitants, was over and came from the housing reform movement, which covered up discriminatory intents with thinly veiled health and safety concerns. It was an early form of exclusionary zoning, which ultimately resulted in banning medium density multifamily homes from being built in Greater Boston and beyond. The result is that 96% of residential land in Massachusetts is zoned for single family only homes today. That's from recent data from the National Zoning Atlas. Researcher Amy Dane writes extensively and persuasively on what she calls the big down zone in Massachusetts, which was essentially the post-World War II practice of eliminating all but single-family zoning. It's no surprise middle housing went missing. It was literally chased away. In Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England, where the local ethos is strong, each municipality controls its own land use through zoning. That's 351 jurisdictions with different zoning and other overlapping ordinances in Massachusetts alone, within a broad framework established by the state. Then, due in part to regulatory hurdles as well as simple construction math, the middle housing product has a lower return on cost per square foot than, say, a 100-unit apartment building, where fixed upfront costs of expenses like bathrooms and kitchens are shared across more units, as are other risky pre-development costs. And finally, as a New England native, I will admit that we can be really resistant to change, even though parts of Massachusetts are some of the most innovative in the country when it comes to tech, healthcare, and research. But change in your backyard, the answer is more often than not in my backyard. But I do want to give credit where credit is due, and Massachusetts, especially in recent years under the Healey-Driscoll administration, has taken impressive strides to increase housing abundance. The reality is that change is hard, especially land use reform that goes back decades in bad policies. A few progressive actions of recent years include the MBTA Communities Act, the transit-oriented upzone, which will likely produce more missing middle units in applicable communities. Accessory dwelling units were legalized statewide through the Affordable Homes Act of 2024. And this year, the state released both a comprehensive housing plan as well as the in-depth Building for Tomorrow report. It's heartening that many of these recommendations acknowledge the role middle housing can play in the housing shortage, and I hope they are adopted in the coming years. That's a brief survey of missing middle housing, what it is, why it's missing, and what its outlook is in Massachusetts. To sum it up, I'll quote Somerville City Council member Matthew McLaughlin when his city re-legalized triple deckers in 2023 as part of the MBTA Communities Law. You can now do what is already there, he said, meaning you can now build new triple deckers again by right or without needing special zoning variance. That's the thing about middle housing. It's actually all around us and it always has been. But unfortunately, it is still illegal to build in many places, which brings us to part two, my second paper, Legalizing Missing Middle Housing in Massachusetts. In this paper, I propose that Massachusetts re-legalize missing middle housing statewide and provide a suite of zoning and other regulatory recommendations to enable these housing types. Why statewide? Because the housing crisis is so severe that more efficient, coordinated, and streamlined reforms are needed to counteract the patchwork of local policies that work against middle housing. Housing markets are regional and require a regional approach. The states that have seen an uptick in these housing types are those that have passed statewide middle housing legislation. To be clear, they are not saying that you can't build single-family homes anymore. Largely, they are removing obstacles to building a wider diversity of homes. In other words, you can't ban middle housing types anymore. Zoning is a power that the state gives to localities, enabling them to set the ground rules for what is built. In Massachusetts, this system was established in 1920. However, there is a history of the state superseding local zoning when a need for housing demands it, most notably Chapter 40B, or the Builder's Remedy Law, that allows an override of local zoning in service of more affordable housing. The 6 reforms I propose in this paper should be seen as a collective of policy changes to allow missing middle housing. Together, they turn up the dial on medium density home types in places where it makes sense to develop at incrementally greater densities. I'll walk through each of them in the coming slides. Some of these reforms have been adopted by states and some by cities. I'll give examples of each to show how effective policy implementation works at both levels. Okay, recommendation one. It may seem obvious, but when it comes to bringing back missing middle housing, you can't build something that isn't allowed. So my first recommendation is to re-legalize middle homes in all residential districts, acknowledging that different communities across the state have different needs and capacities. I propose a tiered approach to adopting missing middle standards. ADUs and duplexes should be allowed in all residential areas. In areas with water and sewer, missing middle structures of up to 5 units should be allowed. So that these home types aren't legalized in name only, density allowances should be increased to match the allowed missing middle types. And while new construction is important, it's also critical to streamline adaptive reuse provisions so that existing single-family homes can be converted to multifamily without rezoning. Oregon was the first to pass statewide missing middle legislation in 2019 through a tiered system that matched missing middle housing types with market sizes. So in smaller cities, duplexes are allowed, and in larger cities, missing middle home types like triplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters are allowed. A key formula to Oregon's success is a policy innovation by now Governor Tina Kotek that included clear and objective minimum compliance standards, a deadline to meet those standards, and a model code that would automatically kick in if those standards weren't met. And this formula encouraged cities to comply on their own without being dragged along. Vermont also took a layered approach to legalizing missing middle housing based on access to infrastructure. And I believe this approach would apply well in Massachusetts with its combination of urban and more rural areas. My second recommendation is to remove or decrease residential parking minimums. Excessive parking can be particularly burdensome for missing middle housing because, as you can see in this graphic, it eats away valuable space in infill lots and can ultimately kill a project's viability. Missing middle also thrives in walkable, transit-oriented areas where residents are less likely to rely on cars for economic, environmental, or personal preference reasons. The Parking Reform Network has advocated for unbundling the cost of parking for rent and charging on-street parking fees instead. Washington is a great example of a state taking good policy and making it even better, even more targeted and effective. After passing statewide missing middle legislation in 2023, this year, Washington came back with a parking reform bill that waives parking requirements for small homes, making missing middle housing even more viable to build. My third recommendation is to reduce minimum lot sizes. While this will vary across the state, 2,000 square feet lot sizes can greatly enable starter homes. Large parcels limit development potential and discourage efficient land use. The reason single-family home sizes have increased so much is because they've grown in lockstep with larger lots. To encourage fee simple missing middle home ownership, I also recommend streamlining subdivisions of small lots. And statewide legislation for lot size could be modeled after Durham, North Carolina, who effectively brought back their starter home market by reducing lot sizes in urban districts by 60%. And since you can build a duplex and an ADU on these lots, and those lots can be next to each other, Durham is seeing a proliferation of creating missing middle pocket neighborhoods of up to 9 units across the city. Staying with the lot level, recommendation 4 is to increase lot coverage and height allowances and reduce setback restrictions. Because even if missing middle housing is legal in name, a slew of density restrictions and technicalities can show up in zoning to limit the percentage of a lot that can be developed. By increasing both lot coverage or floor area ratio and adding flexibility to setback requirements, depending on the surrounding context, a lot more missing middle potential is unlocked, as we've seen in Minneapolis through their built form zoning districts. If concerns about density arise, there are many design best practices that can maintain a sense of privacy even between closely sited dwellings. And then, besides zoning, comprehensive missing middle legislation has to address other regulatory barriers, which is why my fifth recommendation is to streamline the development review process for these home types. There are fundamental differences in size, scale, and complexity between missing middle housing projects and large-scale multifamily or mixed-use developments. And smaller scale, community-oriented developers struggle to navigate the same lengthy review processes as more advanced and larger development outfits. Some cities like Austin are fast-tracking small projects by eliminating site plan review for up to 16 units through their Site Plan Light initiative. Other cities have created by right pre-approved plan sets for ADUs, but South Bend, Indiana is really the national leader in the pre-approved plan movement. Their Build South Bend effort resulted in 7 pre-approved plans that anyone can build for free within the city. The city also offered bilateral sewer connection grants for those using the plans. With 45 homes already built, the South Bend planners aren't kidding when they say that you can get building permits in a day using these plans. And then finally, onerous code standards can still prevent missing middle housing from being built, even if it's legal. So my sixth recommendation is to reform building codes that limit medium density multifamily housing. As missing middle housing falls between single family homes and larger scale multifamily buildings, it would perform best under a new building code that is between the residential and commercial code. Another area that looks promising for increasing missing middle design flexibility is single stair reform for structures of up to 6 units instead of having 2 egresses. The Joint Center and Pew have recently published on this topic, and Massachusetts could study how to safely enact single stair reform from their recommendations. Again, this is an area where the Pacific Northwest is leading the way, and Washington State plans to adopt both single stair reform and a missing middle code exemption in the coming years. So the states that have successfully passed missing middle legislation have shown that statewide preemptions can be complex, but they're not impossible. Here are 5 key takeaways from other states that have made it happen. One is to take an incremental approach. So a great place to start for Massachusetts would be to ask, how has Massachusetts' ADU law been successful, and how can missing middle legislation model that lighter touch density ADU approach? Number 2 is to rely on broad political coalitions. It took Washington State 4 legislative sessions to pass their statewide bill, but in that time, they brought in their support base to include critically stakeholders like the Washington Association of Cities and also to strengthen the legislation itself. Number 3 is to allow for some degree of local control. Statewide reform will fail if cities and towns feel forced into action. So allow for some context sensitivity while also being crystal clear and providing technical assistance about how to implement policies locally. Number four is to use pragmatic arguments. Focus on the fact that middle housing was once common, and it's about bringing it back, not taking anything away. Number five is to opt for economic, not moral messaging. For example, in the face of dissent, say, well, a strong economy needs a strong workforce, and a strong workforce needs housing, and missing middle housing is essentially workforce housing and can be. What gives me hope in conclusion for the legislative recommendations is that policy is a tool, and when that tool isn't working, it can and should be changed. And I hope that policymakers and advocates across Massachusetts use these six recommendations to change the rules that are keeping middle housing missing. All right, so moving to part three, let's take an optimistic perspective. Assuming statewide legislation is passed for missing middle housing, what happens once the right policies from zoning to permitting are in place? So I know we keep calling out the Pacific Northwest, but they are really the leaders in missing middle reform, and Portland, Oregon is an instructive example. In 2021, following the statewide reforms, Portland created the Residential Infill Project, which changed zoning and land use to allow for more missing middle housing. So how did Portland get from this nice schematic drawing on the left to the new missing middle units that have actually been built that you see on the right? Advocacy, funding, developer capacity building to start with. To build a missing middle ecosystem, again, because it's been missing for so long, part three of my report seeks to answer six questions, which I'll review in depth in the coming slides. As a reminder, this report will be released in November, so enjoy the preview now. First, what will missing middle homes look like in your community? A missing middle design guide and pre-approved plan set is a way to show developers, local officials, neighbors, and funders what missing middle housing looks like in a local context, since, like I said, they've just been missing for so long, or you can call out the current existing home types from, 100 plus years ago. Not only that, but pre-approved designs decrease project costs, especially for new developers, both on the design side and through streamlined approvals. I mentioned the Vermont Home Sprawl Toolkit and Design Guide at the beginning, and the state recently announced that they are turning this guide into 10 pre-construction drawing sets that will be approved in communities across the state. So that's a huge leap forward in streamlining the entire process statewide. And Massachusetts can take a page from its northern neighbor, Vermont's toolkit. Next, who will build new missing middle homes? A training cohort can build capacity among local developers, especially small-scale developers who are deeply invested in their local places and understand its unique needs. Missing middle housing offers an opportunity to diversify participation in real estate, and cohort models like Austin's Equitable Development Initiative or Columbus, Ohio's Emerging Developers Accelerator program are training local practitioners to build new housing, grow wealth, and recoup a return on a community as well as investment. And the Incremental Development Alliance, quoted here, is another amazing nationwide nonprofit who's training developers and coaching municipalities alike in small-scale development. Third, where will new homes be built? To jumpstart the middle housing market, it's best to begin with places that are, quote, development ready. That is, whose policies are in order, that are welcoming to new housing, and that may be willing to partner with home builders by identifying development ready sites or even disposing of public land. I love the example of Middle, a Canadian company who works with municipalities across the life cycle of middle housing creation. In Kelowna, they fine-tuned the zoning ordinances, created an education and outreach strategy, and made 4 permit-ready designs that could fit on up to 1,300 underutilized lots, with a guaranteed 10-day approval window. Stay tuned because Middle is expanding into the US, and I think they will become a middle housing player to watch in the coming years. Fourth, how will missing middle housing be delivered efficiently and at scale? A really promising solution is modular and offsite construction. Greater Boston is already working on an offsite construction strategy through a HUD grant. It's important that the outcomes of this grant focus on generating substantial demand for a missing middle specific offsite construction pipeline and including missing middle typologies in a future state-funded manufacturing facility that the grant is exploring. Luckily, one of the most innovative construction companies I know of is in Andover, Mass, Reframe Systems. With 20 projects in the pipeline in Massachusetts alone, Reframe's early successes are proving that smaller scale modular has a place in the construction ecosystem alongside traditional methods. And then the question everyone wants to know, how will new missing middle housing be funded? So I propose that Massachusetts should pilot a middle income housing tax credit modeled after Colorado's and building off the long-time low-income housing tax credit model, but with middle scale provisions to tie affordability to home typology and scale and size. Another needed funding product is a construction loan for smaller scale developers. The Missing Middle Housing Fund is a really cool nonprofit in Oregon who manages revolving investment funds for missing middle pre-development costs, which are the riskiest, including recently a $300 million investment from the state of Oregon. These funds will result in the Housing Innovation Village or Hive, a 10-unit cottage cluster in Newburgh that will offer attainable home prices for members of the local workforce, earning between 80 and 120% of AMI or area median income. Each unit in the pilot community will feature different types of housing innovations, such as automated fabrication, cross-laminated timber, panelization, etc. And this pilot will be completed in summer 2026. Finally, who will coordinate statewide missing middle activity? Well, a statewide missing middle role or office can serve as a central clearinghouse and resource for policy changes, funding sources, technical assistance, and education, as well as special initiatives like a statewide missing middle design guide or developer training cohort. This year, Oregon launched HAPO, the Housing Accountability and Production Office, to ensure that the statewide missing middle bill is actually being implemented and that stakeholders in the public and private sectors are working towards middle housing creation. And Massachusetts could stand up a similar office or role post legislation. The full recommendations for part 3, like I said, will be published in a few weeks, so stay tuned for more. But together, these actions can really create that missing middle sweet spot where zoning, permitting, funding, and community attitudes are aligned. Because without a robust missing middle ecosystem, as small scale developer Neil Heller says, without feasibility or support, you're just legalizing disappointment. I really believe in missing middle housing as one of many powerful solutions to the housing crisis. This solution can really be scaled from large cities to small towns, and I think that's where its power really lies. I hope that the recommendations in this series provide a useful roadmap for Massachusetts and any state or city that is serious about changing its housing landscape to be more abundant, diverse, and affordable. Here are a few further resources I would recommend, especially Jim Hyde's book, Building Small, and his small developer training forums, which take place across the country, as well as I mentioned the Incremental Development Alliance, which trains small scale developers as well as coaches municipal leaders on how to get policies in place to enable small scale development to happen. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in today. The fact that around 500 people are wanting to hear about middle housing on a Friday afternoon is just incredible. And now I'll be happy to answer audience questions.
Amy, thank you very much. Really, and you can probably stop sharing your slides and, well, unless you want to get back to them. We have a boatload of questions. As you've said, there's just tremendous interest in this, and kudos to you for jumping on it. Let me start. Do we have any sense of what happens to property values in places um, that that basically have now mandated the allowance of missing middle housing? Um, is there some, and then what does that do? What does that seem to be doing to the price of the housing that gets built in those new areas?
Yeah, That's a great question. Urban 3 is a land use mapping firm in Asheville, North Carolina, and they've mapped the land use value of places such as Minneapolis that have legalized missing middle homes and have shown in missing middle areas, so areas that have triplexes, et cetera, the home types I mentioned, that the land use value per acre is actually much higher than places with this lower density single family. And I think that's really compelling to show that middle housing, does increase property values. And then also, if you think about from a perspective of sharing infrastructure costs, on a per acre basis, let's just say like more housing units shares that cost. And that's another really great financial benefit of missing middle housing for municipalities.
Related, actually, a question that literally came in while you were talking. Um, do you have any sense as to the impact of legalizing missing middle housing in markets, that are particularly hot? Think, Metro Boston versus, markets where housing just isn't as expensive. I think the Joint Center has been showing that there are very few places where housing might be cheap, but differential impacts of legislation like this between different kinds of markets.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, in hot markets, like I'll take Portland, Oregon as an example, and also because they have data now over the past few years of legalizing missing middle. I was talking to a developer this week, and he, doesn't need additional funding just outside of his private investors to build his missing middle homes. And I think that's really compelling. And, he's like, this market works. It works for it. And Portland's seen over 1,300 middle homes in the past few years since legalizing them. And so, the same potentially could be said for a hot market like Boston. I think when we think about the rollout of legalizing missing middle homes, like it makes more sense to start in more developed places. I don't think starting in the most, rural of places is going to prove out this model per se. Starting in places with that infrastructure with stronger rents, because that's the other thing, like construction is so expensive across the board that in Massachusetts, for example, gateway cities, like the construction prices are about the same as Boston, but the rent discount is much steeper. And so I think starting again, like where will this be successful? What markets and legislation can, as I mentioned, that tiered approach, roll the reforms out in a way that makes it successful, basically.
We have a bunch of questions related to financing, and I'm going to try and bundle them into both one that reflects it and is also coherent. Um, on the one hand, you're talking a lot about a need for some dedicated state or local funding. On the other, and I was struck in your answer just now, somebody indicating, no, I can actually make this work financially. So can you talk a little bit about, do you think, is the state and local funding needed to sort of jumpstart this? And would you expect over time, and I guess in places like Portland, have you seen private lenders beginning to develop more products that may respond to um, the revised zoning?
That would be, I think, the ideal. And so there have not been many private lending products for missing middle home types. I think they're just really too new in a lot of places. But I will say to your earlier point, like, yes, absolutely, the public sector coming in, not just through legislation, but through financing to really jumpstart the market because it's essentially dead. Like it needs like an electric shock, an infusion of capital. And that can also come in different ways, though. Like Portland also put a moratorium on impact fees for missing middle homes for a few years, and like that's a significant driver of bringing back a market. So it doesn't always have to come in like a dedicated funding stream. Although, as I said, a pre-development fund, a construction fund, like those are really needed, I think, especially for the smallest of small scale developers who aren't coming in with a boatload of equity into this.
Yeah. I was struck, when you were talking about this and then in framing the question that the ADU work that the Joint Center did a couple of years ago. I mean, one of the findings was at least it looked like in places like Portland that private private lenders were beginning to now develop products um, that were essentially fostering the financing of ADUs. But ADUs are a little bit an odd duck because you've got a homeowner who may be sitting on a bunch of equity.
Mhm.
I had a question. When you started, you talk about missing middle housing being anything from 5 units, I think, to 19 was sort of. It looked like eyeballing most of the legislation you talked about was allowing, 2 to 6 units, perhaps. Um, is there any place that actually has put in place really opened up things for the kind of that larger scale building, the sort of 10 to 19 units that are clearly a critical part of missing middle.
Well, actually, I would turn that to Massachusetts itself with the MBTA communities law that I mentioned and the transit-oriented districts, which have significantly increased the density in these, near T stops. But, without like specifically calling out all the missing middle home types that can be, it's also it's an aggregation of missing middle that can get to like a 19 unit
Yeah.
cluster of small homes or something. But yeah, I would say the best progress on that has been in transit-oriented legislation. We've seen that in Colorado too, Massachusetts.
So this is could be a little Talmudic discussion, but something like the MBTA Communities Act, which was not a statewide, end of single family zoning, but targeted, actually is doing some of the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
Couple of interesting questions. Flipping back to the rural thing, there was one question that was worried about, if you increase lot coverage in rural areas without sewers, you might increase flooding, and then someone suggested, have you seen any zoning that might be based that might include what's the capacity of the land to absorb things like runoff, sort of almost a soil-based zoning approach?
Mm. Yeah, well, even in Austin, so I'll give an example of a not rural place and then I'll follow up with a rural place to answer the question. But in Austin, I mentioned the site plan light initiative. So that's removing site plan review for first it was up to 8 units, now up to 16 units. But a huge part of that has been coordinating the stormwater runoff and all the regulations around that with, okay, well then if you're not doing site plan review, like how is this working? How can we ensure that these, lots are being developed in an environmentally resilient way? And so that's a huge part of the conversation there. But they figured it out. And then to go to a more rural place, largely rural Maine, they also passed statewide missing middle legislation. And it's, I would say, it's more conservative, it's more context sensitive than say Oregon's. These are completely different places in some ways, but it's you know, in Maine, like it's a very incremental where the lot size has to double to accommodate another ADU, for example. And so it's saying like these are ultimately some quite rural places that aren't necessarily appropriate for middle housing. Maybe they are appropriate for an ADU, and taking into account, yeah, the stormwater runoff, like everything, the roads, the infrastructure that would need to go into it.
There's been a bunch of questions on this idea of providing design guidelines, and in a sense, I think they go in a couple directions. Have you seen any good examples where the design guidelines both facilitated the development of missing middle housing, but also may have assuaged some of the NIMBY concerns of folks worried about what's this thing, if you're going to let this thing in my neighborhood, um, you know, how are you going to ensure that it looks that it feels appropriate? So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit if there's a particularly example of what you think were really well done design guidelines.
Yeah. Well, I'll give a personal anecdote and then I'll point out some well done design guidelines. So, as I mentioned in my time in Vermont, mean, going around to sites and standing in front of vacant lots and being like, okay, neighbors, what do you think of this home type that would fit here? And it's so interesting I think the most effective design guidelines are firmly rooted in the local architectural vernacular. It's not proposing something, crazy, outlandish, too modern. In this case, they're very simple designs. They're based on, Vermont existing homes. And there were even some neighbors or community members that came out and were like, well, why aren't they more modern? And we said, let's start with what's here. And in the future, if you want to build a credible modern home on a vacant lot, have at it. But as far as putting out a standard, I think just starting with homes that model the existing patterns, and that can be also with setbacks, with porches, with roof structures, with fenestration, all of that. But then also fit with the local climatic conditions. So as far as again, in Vermont, like using roof pitching because we have a lot of snow there. But great designs that have combated NIMBYism, I think is like, well, where are the places that the designs are actually being built and implemented? And we're seeing that in like South Bend, of course, but Kalamazoo, Michigan. There are ADU designs in California, Roanoke, Virginia, Spokane, Washington. Like they have these pre-approved plan sets, Groveland, Florida, and it's because they're not just random, like they've been studied and typologically imitate what's already there.
That I think starts to touch on another question I had. I was very struck in your um, list of kind of if you're going to do this, kind of what were the ingredients to the success, the
Mm.
kinds of coalitions, the messaging, and then I think your third was allow some measure of local control. Um, and this strikes me like where's that sweet spot, right? Because of too much local control, may lead you to the kinds of restrictions that you were started with. Too little local control, you wind up with probably a level of backlash that could endanger the program. So, how do you think about what are the things that you would still leave to the locality's discretion, and what are the things, what are the key things that you really want to make sure every locality would have to do?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, to answer the second part first, to re-legalize the missing middle typologies themselves and also the allowable densities. Now, the exact density that's something that can be somewhat like within um, you know, uh boundaries within the local control. And then also some design elements. Like that's why the pre-approved plan sets are great because they work best at a local level. And that's where a locality can absolutely take what is already there and create that set or, implement some of their standards. I think this is where, regional or county level, depending on the state, technical assistance is really important to come in and work at that more local level and translate between the state and the municipal. And, this say two more things on that. These rollout processes can take years, and so it's not an overnight thing. And that's where a model code, I think, is also effective because it's like a state baseline, and then the communities can really take that and make it their own and comply in their own way.
Staying on codes for a minute, we've had several questions about how your what's the difference between, or how are they same, the design guidelines you're talking about and a press for sort of form-based codes. And I'll just leave it at that and see if you've got some thoughts about how they're the same or how they're different.
Yeah. So form-based codes generally refers to more of an approach to zoning and density and design. That's, you know, less prescriptive than like specific, almost arbitrary zoning standards. It's really like looking at what's there and then creating more of a visual guide to what can be created through zoning. Whereas the design guides, in some ways, it's doing that, but it's taking it at much more of the granular at lot level and saying like, we're pre-approving this. that means it's about efficiency. It's about streamlining the process. It's not a zoning per se. It's literally like if you build this ADU, let's say, or duplex, this plan here, the process is much shorter and it fits within the community, and you get this design for free. You cut down your architectural fees.
Shifting gears here, there have been a bunch of questions about um, what do we think is, or what do you think, um, is the target market for
Mhm.
missing middle housing, and in particular, a couple of folks have asked, is missing middle some form of, is it some form of affordable housing, at least for, folks in the sort of 80 to 120% AMI range? So again, I don't know do you have some thoughts on what you've been seeing about the price points that missing middle housing is hitting?
Mhm. Yes, so Arthur Nelson, or Chris Nelson, his nickname, he is an amazing professor who has published a lot of demographic material on the missing middle market. But it's largely who I described. It's those looking for variety and diversity in housing types. But here's the thing, in theory, missing middle should be less expensive than, say, a large single family home or like a luxury condo or whatnot. And also, something I didn't mention is these home types are really agnostic to renters or owners. They can be either. But with both the lag in the missing middle market and just the general development costs, currently and the market, like there may not be this giant difference right now in the missing middle product, but if you build a duplex versus, that large luxury single family home, like in, let's say, a market outside of Boston, in theory, that duplex would be less expensive. But as I pointed out in Durham, like by changing policy, Durham brought back its starter home market. It only took a few years, and neighboring cities, Raleigh, Chapel Hill, they're not seeing that influx of homes less than $500,000, the so-called starter home price point right now. And so that's very compelling evidence to me. It won't happen overnight, but there is that potential. And yes, so missing middle homes in theory should be less expensive to the 80 to 100% AMI. And that's where then things like a middle income housing tax credit could come in to help offset and jumpstart the market.
There have been a couple questions on infrastructure, and you make I think a compelling case, and certainly it looks like the politics work out in such a way that um, places that lack water and local provided water and sewer probably can't, you're not going to, what you're going to push for is going to be lower density. It does lead a couple people to wonder, is that going to wind up being an incentive or a disincentive for places to provide water and sewer? Because if they do, they're given the missing middle, they're going to densify in a way that perhaps people aren't sure they want to go. Again, I don't know how you've thought about that, if you've thought through that issue a little bit.
Well, that would certainly be, I'm sure, a weapon that NIMBYs pull out of their,
Yeah.
pockets at community meetings. But generally, there is a place for missing middle in more rural places, especially seeing that in northern New England. For example, many people are very drawn to more community collective living, and so there are offsite community-based sewer solutions that would serve a cottage cluster, 4, 8 units in a more rural place. And then actually though, through the post-COVID ARPA funding, this huge influx of generational funds, really a lot of communities saw this kind of the opposite of the way the question was framed, is like, this is our chance to improve infrastructure, and did that in
Yep.
service of housing, which was already becoming a massive crisis, especially through COVID. And so I think actually the opposite has been true. And something I'll say about that is that the narrative has shifted, I do believe, around increasing density and adding housing, just because this issue touches everyone right now. And, housing affordability you can't go a day without hearing about it. And so I think, the impulse to hold on so closely to these arguments of community character and change, they're not as valid anymore.
Yeah, in my mind, I was looping back to your sort of ingredients for political success, and
Mm.
I was particularly struck by your point about, in many ways, this is politically at least, it works quite well as more of an economic than a moral message. We've only got a couple minutes left, so I want to step back for a second. You told a wonderful story of you got hooked on this, working in Vermont. You came to the Masters in Real Estate program and to the Joint Center really wanting to dig in on this. So you knew something about it. You knew you wanted to go in deeper. And I'm wondering, as you reflect on that, really deep dive, is there anything that particularly surprised you in the research, either something you expected to find and didn't, or something you didn't expect to find and you did, that you just thought was particularly noteworthy in the course of this journey?
Mm. Um, Well, I think that we hear these buzzwords like modular, offsite, but huge topic right now. And then you dig into it and it's like, wow, there's a lot of potential here, I think, for the missing middle product with modular and offsite construction. Digging into that has been really cool to see, in time, the economies of scale, the replicability, because it needs to be, when we're talking about missing middle housing, it's like creating a replicable product, not necessarily on one lot or like one block, as you would see with a multifamily building, but across a city. And so that's where it's been really cool to see some of those intuitions pan out. Um, and then another, I think, just exciting thing has been through the last year in researching Massachusetts, so many innovative documents have come out from the state level. We've seen the state comprehensive housing plan, as I mentioned, and the Building for Tomorrow report from the Governor's Housing Commission in Massachusetts. And a lot of those recommendations, as I said, address missing middle housing. And so it didn't feel like just writing, researching into an echo chamber. It's hopefully putting this out into a really amenable environment who is, at the state level and then locally willing to take these recommendations and earnestly consider them and move them forward. That is my hope. So we'll see.
Well, again, as you pointed out, given, I mean, there's the large audience that not only came but stayed for this. One last quick question for you. I understand that, as if writing 3 papers wasn't enough, and also getting your degree and starting a new job, that next week you have a book coming out as part of the Ivory um, summit, it's called The Little Book of Low cost high impact housing solutions. Could you give us a quick preview of what we'll find, and maybe what we'll hear from you when we invite you back in 6 months?
Sure, thank you. So, I, yes, I'm so fortunate now to be Director of Policy Innovation at Ivory Innovations, which is a foundation in Salt Lake City, Utah, the largest home builder, Ivory Homes. And our CEO, Clark Ivory, is so committed to advancing housing affordability. And so we work together to write this book. And the book proposes the 6 top actions that are actually quite low cost. We think housing affordability, the solutions are so complicated, but again, these are policy actions and things that cities everywhere can do to change the environment, to make it just so much easier for builders to build, to do what they do best, and to really cut down that cost of time. So this book will launch on Wednesday at our Ivory Prize Summit, which anyone can attend for free virtually or in person in Utah. If you go to ivoryinnovations.org, and the book will be free online, also launching Wednesday. Or if you want to get a physical copy, you can do so online. And that's, I think, the direction, just to really sum it all up, the direction that both this book proposes and middle housing in general at the municipal level, at the state level, to kind of think like a developer, as we say here, and how can we cut down on the cost of time for these projects to move forward. And so, here at Ivory Innovations, we're all about solutions, and that's what I hope I've done in my papers as well, is to provide the best solutions for middle housing.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. We have not come to the end of questions, although several people in the Q&A are doing what I'm about to do. You've done just taken on a really important topic. You went through just a remarkable amount of material quickly, but in an incredibly coherent and clear way. I think you're doing what you set out to do, what our friends at Ivory, who have been wonderful partners and colleagues. Just on behalf of everyone who attended and folks who are going to watch, I just want to thank you for terrific presentation. Remind people to look for the last of Amy's papers, which will be coming out in November. And as we said, the release on Wednesday of the little book of low cost, high impact housing solutions. Amy, thank you. Everybody have a terrific day. And we'll see you again, and many of you uh, in about 10 days for another of our housing research seminars. Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.